Thank you very much, Chair. Now, in terms of my presentation, I'll probably echo some of what my neighbors have said. I want to remove one aspect from the debate. Religion as such is neither the problem nor the solution to radicalization. Adopting a religious belief is a spiritual, personal choice, so it comes down to the personal sphere. And nobody is qualified to express a value judgment on this. Now, the whole debate on the Muslim religion, saying that there's good or bad Islam, comparative advantages of Sufism compared to Salism, Sunnism, in terms of Shiism, and so on, all of that comes down to quarrels of dogma. It has nothing to do with radicalization. And this kind of debate tends to perpetuate the idea of manipulating religion for political purposes. Ever since they've existed, religions have been great tools for social mobilization and cohesion, but they've also instrumentalized masses and been a pretext for all human ambitions, even the worst of all. Lots of peoples and communities on the 5 continents have been converted by force, exterminated or enslaved on the pretext that they didn't have the right kind of religion, but mainly to appropriate their belongings and put them to work. Religions have always been a tool of the conquerors and rebels to subject peoples or send them off to be sacrificed. Now, debating the manipulation of religions, well, it could be an interesting idea, but then we'd have to broaden this to religions as a whole since time immemorial. This is really a very banal idea in the history of mankind, the role of religion. When many thousands of young men and women from all different backgrounds, psychologically normal, and the only thing that they have in common is they belong to the Muslim civilization. When all of these young people mobilize spontaneously on all continents and are prepared to sacrifice themselves for a cause, well, this is important, and we really have to hear their voices and try to understand them. And if we do this, what would we hear? Well, a lot of anger, growing anger that unites young people who feel humiliated and excluded, young people who are often uprooted, who don't have their place or any future in societies which are closed, patriarchal and ultra-elitist, young people who no longer believe in the fine words, who want to take control of their destinies, who want to turn the table over and burn the house down. These young people want to make history, whatever it costs. They are building history using their blood and that of others. Jihadism, or violent radicalism, is the degenerate child of an extreme popular revolt, which is every bit as powerful as the hatred of young people for authority and those who support it. It reflects a deeper problem, the massive rejection of the political, economic, and social order, which is synonymous with the failure of previous generations. Well, the West is also a target, obviously. But isn't the West simply reaping what it has sown? And is still sowing. Military inventions everywhere, political interference, blind support for corrupt or oppressive regimes, policies of useless cooperation policies. Now, taken individually, these Western actions might have a meaning. You're trying to do good for others. But they give the youth of other peoples a feeling of humiliation, interference, and support for conservatism. The terrible attacks in Europe were just collateral damage for events taking place elsewhere where the West was heavily involved. Now, these radicalized individuals have to really go all out. We have to protect ourselves, but not at any price. In Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, sometimes spectacular violent movement by radical movements you're seeing more and more of them. And they've even become a threat to the survival of some states. Now, the response of the weakest and least democratic states systematically focus on 2 approaches: massive redeployment of security and military forces and the reinforcement of the legal arsenal to control society. Now, the immediate consequence of these measures is, on the one hand, an upsurge in violence impacting civilian populations in conflict zones and a real degradation of public liberties and respect for human rights. On the pretext of preventing terrorism, journalists are disappeared. Militants from citizens in operations are harassed and repressed. In March 2015, here, in parallel with the 28th session of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, there was a congress on this subject called abuse of anti-terrorist laws in Africa, weakening civil society, deterioration of human rights, and arrest of opposition figures. In many countries, people called terrorists are systematically sentenced to death in sham trials. They are even executed on the spot, sometimes by security forces. Now, calling a movement challenging the established order terrorist or jihadist is tantamount to issuing a license to kill. Now, the consequence of all of these practices by states is that because they have considered for various reasons, whole categories of their cooperation as suspect, as enemies, and treated them as such, these populations have no other choice than to view the state as a threat and to treat it as one. And there are few options available to these peoples. All they can do, they can hide, flee, or rebel. The radicalization of states' efforts to combat opposition movements, sometimes very rapidly called jihadist, facilitates recruitment by extremist groups and helps delegitimize the state as a guarantor of common good, equity, and justice. Now, this twofold radicalization mechanism also impacts the West, and it is devastating indeed. Now, if we look at the so-called wars against terrorism, the UN in 2015 finally decided, and I quote, "There's no gainsaying that this is not casual. When human rights are flouted, aspirations are trampled underfoot, and this whole feeling of injustice, and people are saying that there is going to be radical change, and this becomes very attractive." Now, this awareness comes a little bit late for several peoples, but what's still lacking is recognition of the direct responsibility of some states or some components of these states who have encouraged or instrumentalized violent radicalization, sometimes unknowingly, but most often on purpose, as part of deliberate strategies of power struggle. And in this context, you have the whole idea of de-radicalization. But what de-radicalization are we talking about? There are U.S. government reports saying that nearly 30% of detainees transferred from Guantanamo were suspected to have re-enlisted in the first years following their release. There are some 40 de-radicalization programs throughout the world, and they're all different. The most recent ones were launched in Somalia, Kenya, and Pakistan, and the longest-standing ones have been around since the early 2000s in Saudi Arabia and Singapore. There's been no serious independent evaluation conducted of these programs, but some of these programs are suspected of being a disguised means of reorienting the submission of jihadists towards goals which are more consistent with the interest of established governments, collecting information or identifying the hardcore elements and eliminating them. The idea to join up with an armed group is an evolving process. It is based on a feeling of injustice, the ultimate means of righting or combating a wrong, but also to achieve personal goals. Now, to hinder enrollment in radical movements, you have to make the effort to try to understand the reasons leading such people to sign up. Now, expecting those who are prepared to die for the cause to turn back, that's probably unrealistic. Now, to counter these enrollments, these enlistments, on the other hand, the number of people signing up in these movements and their level of radicalness can be reduced if we try to address the root causes of this hatred and proposing some other alternatives for those who are not yet radicalized. The uprisings in the 1960s and the lead years, the years marked by terrorism, were circumscribed by profound social change. Now, there are revolt uprisings going on in the Middle East and in Africa, but if they don't lead to real change, well, then they will increase, grow, and if nothing changes, degenerate. A power system can only remain in power if it has a mixture between the commitment it creates and the authority it exercises, particularly as far as the young people are concerned. The more a power system emphasizes authority, the greater the cost of remaining in power, the more it isolates itself, and the more polarized society becomes. Dialogue is indispensable, and changes are unavoidable. States which fail to understand this hold on for a while, maybe, but they gradually decay, and sooner or later they collapse. In conclusion, I would just like to mention a recent study by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue on the perception of radicalization by 8 sub-Saharan countries. The study found that the people didn't see radicalization as a problem, but they didn't want to become Islamic zealots. They just wanted a different kind of state, a state that could ensure their security, justice, and improve their living conditions. A state with integrity, close to them, like them, where they could really find themselves. So let's let people really make their own choices. Let's make sure that democratic processes aren't misappropriated. Let's encourage democratic change or even democratic revolution. And finally, let's accept that these processes might not necessarily bring to power parties that are conservative, secular, and pro-Occidental. Then and only then can we have a real answer to the problem of violent radicalization of tens of thousands of young Muslims. Thank you.